So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a paper by Dimitris and I. And just a bit of background with the title, I suppose, when is a just transition? A just transition really sort of evolves out of a conversation that Dimitris and I have had for many years about, well, is that a just transition? What is a just transition? And in addition to that, this proliferation of just transition policies and plans that are being put forward across a number of regions and countries and so forth, and trying to make sense out of how we go about thinking about when is a just transition. So I just want to begin with sort of some observations about the current research. I know this is a session on unions and just transition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about unions and just transition, but really what brings me to this is the fact that lots of the discourse about just transition has moved away from the union discourse about what is just transition, which is a bit of a frustration for me as well as Dimitris. And then look at that question about, okay, well, how do we return to some of those underpinning concerns that unions had in relation to just transition, to develop a sort of a framework, if you like, and then look at two particular cases, one from Victoria in Australia and one Colorado in the US of A, where Dimitris is at the moment, and a bit of overview of our views on where this is headed. So in the just transition literature, it is increasingly, how do I say it, a disparate literature increasingly. It's described as a principle, a process, a practice. Some say it's a sort of a just transition movement. Increasingly, we're talking about just transition policies. And it is a sort of a confusing space in many ways as to what's become of this notion of just transition. And for us, we sort of thought we need to get back to that sort of social justice position about the cost and benefits and the ways in which we seek some sort of socio-ecological improvements, and how and in what ways then those costs and benefits are distributed among communities. So we're sort of wanting to get back at the heart of some of those original concerns about just transition, which trade unions raised so many years ago. And just some general observations around what I think has happened to the research and discourse more generally. There is increasingly a movement towards an emphasis on sort of procedural justice, that there needs to be the importance being community consultation, particularly those regions that are experiencing significant disruption. Among a lot of the policymakers that are using the language of just transition, there tends to be a shift away from employment adjustment concerns in some ways towards regional diversification and economic development as a focal point. Success in many ways is being defined in terms of low unemployment rates, as opposed to some sort of transformational change in the nature of social society and economy. And increasingly, when you read a lot of this stuff, it's hard to find justice at all. It's more about energy transitions. So when we start to unpack this, we start to see the ways in which the environmental aspect is being increasingly opaque or indeed lost. And then there's this debate about, is just transition just a reformist sort of greening capitalism type notion, or is it much more comprehensive in looking at how we reshape economies and societies and so on. And I do have to share this sort of mainstreaming that's gone on with just transition as well. There's a report that recently came out by Deloitte and the World Economic Forum, which is about just transition for chairmen of major corporations and how to handle just transition. So I don't know if that's a victory for the trade union movement or. These are the sorts of questions that we put forward, and how do we get to think about when is just transition a just transition, and how do we evaluate sort of success and failures? So clearly, from our standpoint, there are the environmental aspects we have to think about, but also the social aspects, and the ways in which those social provisions and environmental aspects or provisions align or do not align, and the nature of the disruption as well, and where we and how we go about measuring that disruption, but also that adjustment. And then there's those overarching concerns about how we define the transition zone. Do we define it nationally at a very small local community level, or indeed globally? So it started in that sort of framework. We sort of really rudimentarily put this really dodgy slide together about that question of transition from what to what as the first sort of starting point. If we're moving from a situation of some sort of environmental harm to some sort of sustainable development or green ecology on one level, some sort of economic and social context, whatever that may be, to obviously or hopefully a much more inclusive economy and society, and more sustainable and decent work. Now, there's nothing inevitable about either one of those occurring, and one may occur without the other. And as we think about this debate about reformist versus transformational, we can think about those sort of varieties or shades of just transition as well as we move in relation to those questions. Is it just a greening of capitalism, or are we seeking to achieve something more? So the two case studies we look at are state-based, which we think is sort of innovative in terms of what we're doing, because what we do see in Australia and the United States is the individual states developing their own plans and doing it quite innovatively, despite the federal lack of political will, although that's changed to some degree in both the United States and in Australia. So we look at Victoria in the southern part of Australia, and Colorado in the Midwest in the United States, who have advocated and embraced the sort of just transition action plan. So I'll start with the case of Victoria, and hopefully we'll push the boundaries of technology and see if Dimitris can do the Colorado one. So in the case of Victoria, this is a state heavily dependent on brown coal-fired generation, fossil fuels. The aim is to retire that coal-fired power stations in relatively quickly, 95% by 2035, net zero by 2045. Lots of investment now committed to large-scale solar and wind and offshore wind in particular. Everyone's chasing hydrogen, greater electrification in a range of areas, and of course, EV vehicles, of which we don't manufacture any automobiles in Australia. We'll be importing almost all of those, but there is some ambition that we might get EV eventually. But there's also this aspect of dealing with native timber and ensuring that that's part of the just transition policies as well. Not a lot of detail in terms of what that means for those communities and workers that are dependent on those industries at this stage. Social aspects, and this is occurring all over the place where we see just transition policies, lots of promises of jobs. We've got an election on in Victoria, and the number just keeps increasing by the day. We're now up to 59,000, of which my union comrades go, really? Where are those going to come? So we do see that, but there's a complete lack of detail about that. We see lots of commitment about local procurement, but no significant industrial planning in terms of how we're going to build that manufacturing base to maximize the job potential out of this. There's a lot about developing a clean workforce development strategy, as we see in many of these plans. And then, of course, that commitment to some sort of procedural justice. Not a lot of detail on that front and what that actually means. But clearly, there's a heavy reliance on the private sector to drive this. Although, as part of election promises, there has been talk about now renationalizing some aspects of the electricity system, but not a lot of detail as to what that actually means, and a lot of cynicism in communities that once got a lot of benefit out of a nationalized electricity system. And one of those areas is the Latrobe Valley, which Marcus may talk a little bit about as well. But the Latrobe Valley is the heart of that power generation industry in Victoria. It's the area where the significant change is taking place, where coal-fired generators are being shut down. And it is there that really this discussion and discourse at the state level is, in many ways, hits at the guts for the people in those communities. But what we see is increasingly at a state level wanting to define the region of transition as a larger region. So rather than define it as the Latrobe Valley, that little bit of circle there, which is about 70,000 people, it's being increasingly defined as a Gippsland region, which is that broader region, which is basically the size of Switzerland, I think it is. And so there's a lot of concern about the state defining just transition in a way in which the Latrobe Valley and its concerns at the local community level become diluted, and the support and concerns that they have may be undermined through that process. So for our standpoint, then the question becomes, how close enough is just transition to count from a regional perspective? Who defines what is the region in transition? How do we define then who should get priority to so-called new energy jobs, these 59,000 jobs, supposed jobs? And how do displaced workers transition? Is it achievable? Is it desirable? Is that just, and so on? And so we do have a lot of proposed new renewable energy projects in the area. I'm going to skip this bit, but it is a question of, local benefits of who benefits from these projects. And increasingly, we're seeing the components for these large wind generator farms being brought in from overseas, in this case being brought in from Taiwan, rather than going to local manufacturers who have the capacity to do some of that stuff. So the global supply chain challenges in accomplishing the just transition are very real. All right, Colorado, Dimitris.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Colorado has a full-blown just transition policy that covers the whole state, but only with respect to coal. And it's important to note that because coal is important for the production of electricity in Colorado, but the major source of energy is natural gas and secondarily oil. So that was a very strategic decision because natural gas is very powerful in the state. So the just transition policy covers the formal coal plant workers, the coal mining communities, and the railway workers that carry coal. So that's the people that are covered. And as you can see in the picture there, it covers both coal plants and coal mines. However, it does not mandate that coal mines be closed. Some of them will close automatically because they supply local coal plants, but those that produce metallurgical coal can continue working if they have markets. Let's go to the next. So the social aspects are quite good, in fact, for those who are covered. And there's a big discussion right now whether, in fact, in addition to covering the workers who work in those coal plants and coal mines, the policy should also cover the workers in subcontractors that totally depend on those plants. It's an interesting expansion, a positive expansion, I think, of the policy. The disproportionately affected communities, and it's a special category in the United States, environmental justice communities, although they participated in the process of formulating the just transition policy, they have essentially been left out. That's one of the weak points of the policy in terms of social inclusion. Let's move forward because I think we're coming to the end. Let's look at the environmental aspects. They are implied in the shutting down of the industry. There might be some remediation as a result of the funds that go to coal communities for diversification and creating a new industry, but otherwise environmental improvements and justice are indirectly covered by the just transition policy. So the just transition policy may be more socially just, but with respect to those workers and communities covered, but environmentally, that's a problem. And in fact, the state of Colorado has a totally separate environmental justice process unfolding right now. Next. You can finish it.
Okay, so, all right. So look, I realize I'm out of time, so I'll wrap this up very quick. But look, I think this question of, if nothing else, ensuring when we think about just transition policy and the successes and what makes just transition just, we do need to get back to those environmental and social elements across space and time. And we do need to think about, how long are we going to give the transition? Are we talking 5 years? We talking 10 years? We talking 50 years? How long do communities need to wait? But we need to think about, do we want something more than just a greening of capitalism? Are we looking for something more in terms of transformational just transition, which many unions and indeed community groups are asking for as well? So I'll leave it at that.